So, we are not quite out of the water just yet. I want to travel to the Pacific to discuss another lost civilization. The reason I discuss a variety of topics on this show is because things tend to make more sense when you know what they are. For example, if someone were discussing Planet X and mentions the Anunnaki, it would be beneficial to you to know who the Anunnaki are, right? Now, the lost civilization I am referring to was once the sunken continent of Mu, or Lemuria. And the reason I like to discuss ancient history is because it gives us insight on why things are the way they are today, and what we may have to look forward to in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, if these ancient people existed in these ancient societies that were wiped out, then it is pertinent that we understand what happened to them, how it happened to them, and why. As human beings, knowing our history doesn't really save us from our future. It really doesn't. We go through these cycles. History repeats itself and we make the same mistake over and over again. But even though civilizations have perished, a few have managed to survive. So, if we are on the brink of losing our current civilization, and if there is a chance for surviving what's to come, then I suggest we learn how. So I can't talk about Atlantis without talking about Lemuria, or the land of Mu. Now I'll tell you, in my research, in my findings, I have come across many, many people who know a lot about nothing. I can't tell you how many times I've come across the topic of Lemuria and Atlantis only to hear someone's mystical rant, leaving you with many questions unanswered. And we'll get into the Akashic records, channeling, and crystals another time. So first, let's talk about the maps. I've seen Lemuria placed in the Pacific Ocean near Australia. I've seen it placed all across the Pacific. That's almost half the world. I've seen it placed in the Indian Ocean. I've seen Lemuria and Mu as two separate locations. So we obviously have a misunderstanding here. Now, I do believe that there was in fact a country or continent that once existed in part of the Pacific, as well as the Indian Ocean, so we'll start there, since this is where the word Lemuria comes from. It was Philip L. Sclater, a zoologist, who in 1864 theorized that there must have been a landmass between India and Madagascar, since he found the same species of monkey, the lemur fossil, in both India and Madagascar, but not Africa. So unless these lemurs could swim better than a fish or operate a boat, there must have been something to connect the two land masses. Otherwise, they would have to have been transported by humans. So he called the missing continent Lemuria, in honor of the lemur. Over the years, we've had several authors write about the lost continent. Madame Blavatsky of the 19th century, for example, describes Lemurians as the third race. The Atlanteans would be the fourth race, and the fifth is our own. She also describes them as having 4 arms and an eye on the back of the head for psychic vision. They only used telepathy to speak, and they lived in caves. W. Scott Elliott also gives a similar description of the Lemurians, stating that they had an eye on the back of the head, a flat face with no forehead, brown skin, notice I said brown skin, wide-gapped eyes, and they stood about 12 to 15 feet tall. Again with the giants. I'm assuming by their description that Lemuria was the land of the giants, or Nephilim. Now, James Churchward Researcher, archaeologist, learned his information from the ancient Nakal clay tablets found in India in the early 1900s. Churchward's stories are quite interesting. In his writings, he tells us how when traveling through India in the 1870s, he was at a temple where he met a rishi, which is a Hindu sage or great seer, somewhat of a prophet whose messages are realized through poetry. James and the rishi ended up becoming good friends after inquiring about the symbolic writing on the walls of the temple. Some say that James studied there for 2 to 5 years before the rishi told him of some tablets that were locked in a vault underneath the temple. These were identified as the records of the Nakal Brotherhood, a brotherhood devoted to preserving the knowledge passed down from the lost continent of Mu. Now this rishi, or priest, or Jedi, also demonstrated his psychic abilities to Churchward, such as the Jedi mind trick, where he could implant thoughts into people's minds, as well as cause them to hallucinate. He was invulnerable to fire, and he explained to Churchward that he was one of the last remaining 3 survivors of the Nakal Brotherhood. Let me point out to you all, by the way, that the rishi is a Hinduist, and one of their deities is Shiva. And what does Shiva wield? That's right, a trident. Looks like Poseidon and Shiva have the same taste in weapons. What a coincidence. So James and the rishi began to go through the tablets that were there. He described Mu being located in the Pacific Ocean and calls it the Garden of Eden, linking all civilizations back to Mu. From the Mayans to the Greeks to the Egyptians to the Sumerians to Atlantis, all civilizations originating from Mu. He tells us that Atlantis was colonized by people of Mu, and he states how it was lost. Volcanism, causing the Archean gas belts to blow up beneath the continent, causing the continent to collapse in the course of one day. Almost all 64 million people gone. He also stated that the mountains were raised and the radius of the earth shrunk. The problem with James Churchward's accounts is that no one has ever seen the Nakal tablets, and he waited up to until the 1920s, 50 years, to tell anybody about them. And no one can even locate the temple he visited or where it may have been. However, 1 or 2 individuals have given testimony to the tablet's existence. So the question is, where are the tablets? Well, there are some who believe that these tablets are stored in a secret vault somewhere around the world, and some believe that they were sold off to collectors over time. 2 associates of Churchward, Augustus and Alice Le Plongeon, were Mayanists who were in search of connections between Egyptian and Mayan cultures. They theorized that the Mayans were great sailors that colonized the world, and the Mayan masters were known as the Nakal, or the Exalted. Except the Plongeon's continent of Mu was set in Central America instead of the Pacific. Now, the majority of scientific evidence suggests that human life originated in Africa, which could have been both Atlantis or Mu, as some believe that Atlantis was the entire known world at that time. Mu could have stretched from Africa all the way through Australia, through the Pacific, to the Americas. So here's something that is crazy. James Churchward suggested that the people of Mu, which he called the Mayas for some strange reason, probably influenced from his friends the Plongeons, since they pushed him to write his book on Mu. He describes the people of Mu, the Mayas, as light-skinned with blonde hair, blue eyes, and he credits them building all the megalithic structures across Central America, Egypt, Sumer, all built, controlled, and dominated by the white Mayas. So again, we have a problem here. The same issue we have with Plato, giving a narrative that is probably biased and some would say racist. Even James Churchward's great-grandson, Jack, believes that Churchward's writings were racist to say the least. But Before we call racism, let us keep in mind that the Incas tell us the tale of Amaru Muru. Also, let us not forget that Noah was suspected to have albinism. The book of Noah reads in chapter 106, "And his body was white as snow, and red as the blooming of a rose. And the hair of his head and his long locks were white as wool, and his eyes beautiful," which in Ethiopia is believed to be canical. Now, if this confuses people about the lineage of certain races, you need to stop worrying about what complexion a certain character may have been. It will get you nowhere. I know I hear it all the time. We created this, we created that. No, you didn't create crap. People from thousands of years ago who have almost absolutely nothing to do with you created those things. And I suspect that all civilizations at that time had a variety of different looking people. And because of this, I am sure that they had a variety of racist people as well. Just something these dark entities could use to pit us against each other. Another scam. Sometimes we forget what human beings are capable of conceiving. It is pretty obvious that James Churchward and Plato embellished their stories to please whoever they needed to please at the time. Or maybe they did not. But we may be able to still rely on their telling of the chain of events. You know, authors often change names of characters, their descriptions, so that it won't sound like someone else's story or to protect identities. But they do try to at least stick to what happens in the story regardless. So this may be what we are dealing with when it comes to Plato, James Churchward, or anyone else describing something that they themselves were not there to witness. It is to be expected. William Niven is another one. Now, the tablets he found in Mexico by himself actually exist, some 2,600 stones. However, only about a dozen of these stones have been located. Are they authentic? The evidence says probably not. So let's go to Frank Joseph, a diver who has been in the waters around the world, an archaeologist who has actually been in on these expeditions to explore the underwater world. According to Frank Joseph, Mu, Lemuria, there are several names for the same place depending on the culture. For instance, the Japanese call it Kanai. In India, it is Kumari Kandam. And Frank seems to be quite certain of his findings. He believes that the Sumerians once colonized Central America, and I am sure they did, along with the rest of the world. What do you think? The Sumerians just sat around in their little world and said, "Screw the rest of the planet. We ain't exploring it." No, because as a society with a growing population, you run out of resources. So, you have to go outside of your native land to get more resources, especially if your population is in the hundreds of thousands, no matter how much you try to sustain. Frank Joseph also talks about the Chief Joseph Tablet, a leader of the Nez Perce tribe, Chief Thunder rolling down the mountain. Yes, that's his name, Chief Joseph for short. Surrendered to the U.S. government back in 1877. Chief Joseph gave the U.S. General Miles a 1-inch squared clay tablet. It was an ancient sales receipt for one lamb, dating back to around 2024 BC in the Assyrian language. Chief Joseph says it was inherited from their white ancestors. Now, what's more interesting are the stone towers that Frank Joseph talks about, found in Japan, Bolivia, Easter Island. These were supposedly repositories for umbilical cords, which suggests that these people knew of the healing properties of stem cells. But again, we have a problem here, because Frank Joseph was once Frank Collin, an ex-member of the Nationalist Socialist White People's Party. We have other connecting pieces of evidence. For instance, why is it that we find elongated skulls among the ancient Egyptians and also in Peru? I know that some of these skulls are actually artificially deformed by wrapping and binding a newborn baby's skull, so that in the coming months and early years the child would have the head of an alien, perhaps to represent a noble class. But when you do this to a child, the head can only be misshapen like a cone head, not elongated, adding extra mass to the skull. Now those skulls remain mysterious. Another thing that I have found interesting are the stories from Native American tribes such as the Menominee Indian, who tell stories of how a different race of humans came to the shores of Lake Superior to mine very high-grade copper. Now what would these people need copper for? Does this have anything to do with orichalcum and Atlantis? Who knows? But Frank Joseph attributes this mining to bringing in the Bronze Age in Europe, which is obviously not an antediluvian time period. But what it does tell us is that these people who came to mine the copper, I suspect, somehow knew beforehand that an abundance of copper was there. How did they know this? Perhaps from information passed down by their ancestors, who probably mined copper from the Great Lakes in a time ancient to them. But that's just a guess. As we look around the world to investigate these ancient cultures, you should be painting a picture in your head, tying things together. These are not things we are taught in school, and so much of this information is new to us, as there are so many more things we have yet to explore. So as we get closer to the truth about our history and origins, we come to a better understanding of the world we live in today and what we have to look forward to in the future. I would like to say that our future looks bright, but the way things are going today, it looks more like Lemuria's dark past.